Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome folks to our annual presidential plenary. Thank you very much for your participation at LERA's 74th annual meeting, our second virtual conference. We're receiving very positive feedback on the program, and ultimately that is because of the quality of the sessions. So a special thanks to everyone who has been a presenter or speaker or discussant or chair of our sessions at this year's meeting. At an in-person meeting, I'd be speaking to you from the podium and you'd be finishing lunch. And I would introduce everyone at the head table. But since we're meeting virtually, I will recognize people by name. And if you're online, perhaps you could just give a little wave so we can see you. First, I'd like to acknowledge our national LERA past presidents who are in attendance. Eileen Hoffman, Eileen Applebaum, Janice Balachi, Bonnie Castry, Joel Kucher-Kirschenfeld, Adrian Eaton, Harry Katz, Tom Kochen, David Lewin, Lisa Lynch, Bob McCursey, Don O'Brien, and Stephen Slay. I tried very hard not to miss anyone, and I hope I succeeded. At this point, I want to hand the mic over to Wilma Liebman for the introduction of our 2022 Lifetime Achievement Awards. Wilma?
Yes, thank you, Paul, and congratulations to you becoming LERA president. You've done a great job with this year's program as program chair. Paul, as you will learn, one of the greatest privileges of being LERA president is the opportunity to select the Lifetime Achievement Award recipients. It is my real pleasure and honor to grant the awards today to Bernard Anderson and Lisa Lynch, two individuals with long records of rich achievements and contributions in their fields and involvement and commitment to LERA. Both of today's honorees have in their careers blended theory, practice, and policy, enriching this complex and dynamic field of labor and employment relations. To introduce each honoree, I have invited a close professional colleague of the honoree, an active LERA member, and also a friend of mine. Janice Balachi will first introduce Bernard Anderson. Just a few words about Janice. She is a longtime colleague of Bernard Anderson. She is Professor Emeritus of Legal Studies and Business Ethics at the Wharton School, the University of Pennsylvania. She's an expert in business and human rights and international labor standards. For 15 years, she was a member of the Committee of Experts at the ILO in Geneva. She's a past president of National LERA, International LERA, and of the Philadelphia chapter of LERA. Janice. You're muted, Janice.
Thank you, Wilma. It is really my great pleasure today to introduce Bernard E. Anderson. Recently, when I was thinking about our field and what we've done, and thinking about events in the last couple of years in the United States and Black Lives Matter, it occurred to me that people in LERA had been doing this sort of research 40 and 50 years ago. And Bernard Anderson's name just leapt to mind. So, at first I had to think for a moment, because I've known Bernie since the late 70s. So when you know somebody well who's in the next office, sometimes you don't think of their prominence and their incredible contribution to the field. So let me just say quickly, Bernie grew up somewhat near where I grew up. As you might guess, he grew up in an African-American neighborhood, and I grew up in an Italian-American neighborhood. But they were close together, and they were, at the time, solid, stable neighborhoods. And he says that when he went shopping, I guess with his mother, he would notice at various places that white people seemed to have more money, frankly, to be able to spend on things. And this got him interested in earnings and differences. And that when he went to college, he majored in economics. He went to graduate school at Michigan State, and one of several mentors, but one of his advisors was Jack Stieber. Many of you know how active he was in this organization. And Jack, among others, encouraged him to do a PhD. And also someone, I don't know if it was Jack, when he went to do the PhD, said, you have a great program right in your own backyard in Philadelphia at the Wharton School, at which time George Taylor was still active. And Bernie came back to Philadelphia and did a PhD. And then he started on his tenure track at Wharton in the late 1970s. And that's sort of just around then I met him, being struck by, I must say, his impeccably dressed, erect military bearing. And now I realize he was in the military, and his deep, almost baritone resonant voice. So he did what most academics do. They start, research and publishing and teaching, all that. And his field, from what I just said, was looking at what his specialty was looking at the labor market and looking at the position of African Americans in the labor market, job ladders, for instance, which job ladders they were put on, were they dead end, which sort of training did they receive, etc. He did all those types of research. And this is late 70s and in the 80s. And you go back and you look at the titles of those articles, and they could be written today. I just want to say so, and he probably will talk about that a bit more. By the way, coming back to Philadelphia, he joined LERA, both nationally. In fact, he was on the executive committee, I think around then, maybe the 80s. And he also joined the Philadelphia chapter of LERA. So he's been a LERA stalwart for decades. And then he made tenure and he made full professor. And I want to say something. At the time he did this, no one said, oh, he's the first Black person to make tenure in the Wharton School, but he was. And I guess he was the first to make full professor as a result. It was a singular achievement, but it wasn't made a big hoopla like might be today. Now, in 1993, he did something that most of us at Wharton would be shocked by. I mean, full professor at the Wharton School and you go away. But it was the Clinton administration, and he went to the Department of Labor. And he will tell you, to the Employment Standards Unit, and it was assistant secretary. But now looking at it, I see that Bernie was so committed to what he was doing in his research that he wanted to try to have a real impact and make a difference. And he went to Department of Labor, and he'll tell you what he did. And then when, after the end of the Clinton administration, he might have come back to Wharton, but at that point, the Rockefeller Foundation, one of its major initiatives was in an area that interested him, and he stayed. Once again, I consider him an amazing scholar practitioner. And finally, near the end, it was he came back to the Wharton and became the first Whitney Young professor. To this day, he writes. You can see things he publishes. He has always been committed to, I was going to say, eliminating racial disparities if possible, but certainly improving the situation and taking action to do that through both his research and his own activities. So to my wonderful colleague, I couldn't say it's been more of a pleasure to introduce you, Bernie.
Well, thank you very much, Janice, for your generous introduction. And thank you for your friendship and being my colleague on the Wharton School faculty. We were next door neighbors, as you have indicated, in Vance Hall for a long time. Let me say that I'm highly honored and deeply humbled to receive the LERA Distinguished Lifetime Achievement Award. It recognizes the journey of 1,000 miles that took me from a 3-story female-headed household in South Philadelphia to the heights of higher education and public service. I thank God for blessing and guiding me along the way. I have many to thank for my career. First is my mother, Dorothy Gideon Anderson. May she rest in peace, who encouraged me to get an education, set high standards for myself, and to work hard to get ahead. She was a sterling role model for me, as she worked 27 years in a federal civil service job for the U.S. Navy in Philadelphia. On my journey, I was guided and supported by a number of men who helped me see the way toward addressing the issue that consumed my interest, and that is racial inequality in American economic life. Dr. Andrew F. Brimmer, the first Black man appointed to the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, was one of my professors at Michigan State, and he became my mentor, my former professor, and close friend throughout my career. At Michigan State, I was also taught and mentored by Professor Jack Stieber, who served as former president of LERA. Jack Stieber recommended that I join IRRA, and following his advice, I did so as a student and started attending the annual meetings. While working on, let me add that while working on the doctorate at the University of Pennsylvania, I was taught by Professor George W. Taylor, one of the founders of IRRA. Professor Taylor is the man who offered me the faculty position at the Wharton School when I completed the doctorate. I also owe a debt of gratitude to the late Professor Herbert R. Norton, who, my dissertation advisor, who was the source of much of the funding that supported most of my early research. I will add that Professor Peter Capelli, who is still at the Wharton School, who brought me back to the Wharton School faculty on an endowed chair when I completed an extended leave to serve in the Clinton administration. Now, throughout my career, I focused on racial inequality in American economic life. It is broad, it is deep, and it is persistent. It continues to diminish the quality of life for millions of African Americans. And in fact, Black people have a relationship with the American economy similar to the caboose on the train. When the train speeds up, the caboose speeds up. When the train slows down, the caboose slows down. But in the natural order of life, the caboose never catches up with the engine. The rate of unemployment for Black workers has been at or near twice the rate of unemployment for white workers since the data have been collected by race since 1954. The median income of Black households has never been closer than 60% of the median income of white households. The greatest gap is in wealth. According to the latest measures, the median net worth or wealth of Black people is less than $20,000, or less than 13% of the median wealth of white families, which exceeds $100,000. About 1/3 of all Black families have either no wealth or negative wealth. Now, the persistent gap in the economic opportunity not only diminishes the quality of life for African Americans, it also constrains stable, balanced economic It's been estimated that racial economic inequality reduced the total GDP by as much as $1.3 trillion over the past 2 decades. I have spent my career studying, explaining, and seeking a solution to this national problem. And I will continue to do the research, to publish, and to speak out on this issue. This award encourages me to continue on. As Dr. King often said, the arc of the universe moves slowly, but bends toward justice. Thank you for this award, and God bless you.
Thank you, Professor Anderson, for your very thoughtful remarks. Congratulations on your lifetime achievement and for today's award. I have known Lisa Lynch and very much admired her for a long time, but I invited David Weil, her close colleague who succeeded her as dean at the Heller School, at the Heller School for Social Policy and Management at Brandeis University, to do the introduction. David is an internationally recognized expert in employment and labor market policy. Before joining the Heller School, he was appointed by President Obama and served as the Department of Labor's Wage and Hour Administrator. He held that position till the end of the Obama administration. He was nominated to return to that post by President Joe Biden in 2021. Maddeningly, politics frustrated his Senate confirmation, but as he says, he was proud to be nominated and supported by the president and 47 senators. I just would comment and that I hope many of you heard Lisa Lynch's participation in this morning's plenary session on supply chains. If you missed it, please do watch a recording. So David, I turn to you.
Thank you, Wilma, for that introduction. And it's really my pleasure and honor to introduce the Lifetime Achievement Award winner, Lisa Lynch, today. There is so much to say about Lisa, and I only have 5 minutes. So I think, like ancient Gaul, I'm going to divide Lisa's amazing career and achievements into 3 areas. First of all, there are her academic achievements that, of course, include her past presidency of LERA and her longtime involvement with this organization, including, as Wilma just mentioned, in the plenary earlier today. Lisa is, of course, in the academic field known as a labor economist who holds currently the Maurice Hexter Professor of Social and Economic Policy at Brandeis at the Heller School. Lisa earned her bachelor's in economics and political science at Wellesley, her master's and PhD in economics at the London School of Economics, and then has had a career as a faculty member at the Ohio State University, MIT, Tufts, the University of Bristol, and of course now at Brandeis University. She is also a research associate at 2 of the most prestigious economics organizations in the world, the National Bureau of Economic Research, and she is a research fellow at the Institute for Labor Economics, IZA, in Germany. Lisa's work is known particularly for publishing on the impact of technological change and organizational innovation on productivity and wages, and in particular, groundbreaking work in a number of different areas of the role of training on those and other outcomes. She studied the determinants of youth unemployment, school to work transition, and many, many core issues in labor economics, and has published, again, in the most distinguished journals in the economics profession, the American Economic Review, as well as in our field at LERA, industrial relations, and so on, as well as publishing in policy and popular outlets. And she remains an important voice on the determinants of productivity through training, work organization, and public policies, which I know she will continue to contribute. But then the second pool is her bona fides in the area of government policy. And once again, she has served in some of the most impactful and prestigious positions in government economic policy. She is currently a member of the Economic Advisory Panel of the New York Federal Reserve Bank. She, of course, served as one of the early chief economists at the US Labor Department during the Clinton administration. She's been a director and then chair of the board of directors of the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, and the chair of the Conference of Chairmen of the Federal Reserve System. Many of those roles she held at the same time as holding academic positions, which I'll outline. And she's also served in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts on the Governor's Council of Economic Advisors, and on a number of occasions in the National Academies. So there is a distinguished government set of activities. And then we get into the third bucket of activities where she has been equally distinguished, and that's as an academic administrator, where she has served at Brandeis, not only as the dean of the Heller School, but also as the provost and executive vice president of academic affairs, and as the interim president of Brandeis University. And also served before coming to Brandeis as the academic dean at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts. So one could give those three domains to one person. Lisa has managed to achieve all three in one career. And the question is, how can you distinguish yourself so much across such different areas, obviously linked by the kinds of issues we all care about in LERA, but what allows one to achieve that? Well, I will explain it just briefly in picking one activity that she's engaged in, and that's the one I've known her most recently for, and that is her role as a Brandeis provost. As all of you who are academics in the audience well know, a provost is the chief academic officer who makes decisions that affect hundreds of faculty, staff, students. But particularly, they make decisions about matters that faculty regard as their domain themselves. And in fact, one of the reasons why provosts are often not the most popular figures on campuses is all of the faculty always believes that they could have made the decision better than the provost could have. Well, in contrast to how provosts are sometimes regarded, Lisa was widely admired at Brandeis in that capacity and through some very difficult years and times. And that's really because, again and again, decision after decision, she brought intelligence, compassion, and vision to the multitude of decisions she faced. She never shrank from tough discussions, nor making sure that the different views at the table were being vetted, examined, and considered. And she not only accepted those differences, she encouraged demands and explored them. And she exhibited that in a space very close to what we care about at LERA. Lisa believes in voice at work and the value of collective bargaining. And she showed this not only in her scholarship, but at Brandeis by making Brandeis one of the early universities to recognize and bargain with part-time faculty and PhD students, and crafting a very innovative space for that to occur. She showed her belief in a willingness to endorse basic workplace rights by, close to my heart, being one of the first universities to support the overtime rule that we put out during the Obama administration. But in particular, the characteristics I've just described came out in the pandemic, where Lisa's leadership on campus, digging into the numbers, into the facts, and into what we knew about COVID at different stage, helped the university steer through very successfully that great crisis. So those characteristics of intelligence, vision, decisiveness, and compassion and manifesting itself in walking the talk is really manifests itself across all three domains I've talked about. And that is why Lisa Lynch is so perfectly suited to receive this award today. Thank you.
Oh, golly. That's really quite overwhelming. Thank you, David. I'm actually a little tired listening to those three buckets. I have to say one of the things that I'm proudest of as provost was recruiting you to the position of Dean of the Heller School. And it has been a real honor to work with you along with the other deans as we navigated some difficult times and some challenging moments and also some really important and great moments. I want to say that I want to thank everyone for this honor and receiving this recognition of my work. I have to say, though, that I'm especially thrilled to receive this honor alongside Professor Bernard Anderson. I was fortunate to have worked with Bernie when we both served in the U.S. Department of Labor in the 1990s. Professor Anderson showed how an academic could leave the ivory tower and put research into practice when he served as the Assistant Secretary of Employment Standards at DOL. He was an inspiration for me as we worked together in the Clinton administration to develop and implement policies that generated more and better jobs in our economy, especially for young Black workers, which had been the focus of his scholarship and had been the focus of much of my early work as an academic as well. Professor Anderson and I also shared the privilege of working closely with the late Professor Phyllis Wallace, a professor of industrial relations at MIT's Sloan School of Management, a former IRA president, and the first woman full professor at Sloan. Phyllis broke through dual discrimination barriers as an African-American and as a woman, and contributed path-breaking work as a scholar and policymaker to open up the labor market to women and minorities. But what I think she enjoyed most was mentoring the next generation of scholars and practitioners. And I was one such beneficiary of her mentoring. She supported my development as a labor economist from my early days as a student at Wellesley College when I took labor economics from her, and later on when I joined the faculty in industrial relations at MIT. In accepting this award, I want to recognize the many ways in which LERA and its previous incarnation, the Industrial Relations Research Association, have been a critical resource for me throughout my career as a scholar, teacher, policymaker, and senior leader in higher education. Early on in my academic career, I was able to publish my work on racial and gender differences in the returns to private sector training in the IRA proceedings, when more traditional journals were reluctant to publish such research on what I was told by some editors was viewed as less important for our understanding of the labor market. Participating in national and local chapter meetings helped me build a broad network of colleagues whose research and willingness to share real-life labor workplace experiences benefited my scholarship and my policy work, in particular at the Department of Labor when I served as chief economist. The many LERA panels and forums on collective bargaining helped inform how I engaged as provost at Brandeis University with our part-time faculty and graduate students as they first voted to unionize, and then as we worked together to develop our first collective bargaining agreement, which David has talked about. And I really am very proud of our collective bargaining agreements and what we worked to establish with those two collective bargaining agreements. Frankly, the need for LERA has never been greater than now if we truly want to secure a more shared prosperity in this country. Or as Bernie said, if we want to make sure the caboose and the engine are running side by side. Given the current political discourse and the ease with which we can isolate ourselves in our own echo chambers, we need to find new ways to pull together rather than pulling apart. Rising inequality and increased concentration of wealth truly runs the risk of corrupting and, as we saw on January 6th, even obliterating our democracy. This is where an organization like LERA can and must play an important role. As the only organization in the country where labor, management, government, academics, advocates, and neutrals meet to discuss and learn about all aspects of labor and employment relations, we're an important venue for the development of new ideas and frameworks to advance a more inclusive economy. We all need to continue to support and expand the convening role that LERA can play at both the local chapter level and nationally with social partners. As I look at the depth and diversity of our program for this meeting, and thank you again, Paul, for having such a terrific program, I'm encouraged and inspired by all my LERA colleagues, and I'm so optimistic for our future. Again, I thank you all for this very special honor, and I want to especially thank Wilma Liebman for her exceptional leadership of LERA and making sure that COVID did not thwart the important ways we listen and learn from each other. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa, for your kind words, and congratulations again for your wonderful achievements and for receiving this award. Turn back to you, Paul. You're on mute.
The phrase that has been said more than any other this week, you're on mute. But what a great thing it is that our association has such distinguished members. Just wonderful. Well, now it's my pleasure to introduce our 74th LERA president, Wilma Liebman. As many of you know, Wilma has a long record of service as a member and chair of the National Labor Relations Board. She was first appointed to be a member of the board by President Clinton and was twice reappointed by President Bush. In January 2009, President Obama appointed her as board chair. She served in that position until August 2011, when her third term expired. She left the board as the third longest serving member in its history. Just counting the number of years Wilma served on the board doesn't do justice to her legacy. She led and carried the board through some of its biggest crises, and perhaps its most difficult period since it was formed. Dealing with partisan gridlocks in Congress that depleted the budget and blocked confirmations of board members. Wilma kept the faith through it all, maintained the integrity of the board, and for that, our profession owes her a tremendous debt of gratitude. Prior to appointment to the board, Wilma served as deputy director of the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service. And earlier, she worked in the legal departments of the Bricklayers Union and the Teamsters. Since stepping down from the board, she has taught at several universities, including NYU Law School, Rutgers, Cornell, Illinois, and George Washington. She also has been engaged in various advisory roles and consulting projects, too numerous to list here. But one role I will mention is her current one as Chief External Ethics Officer for the UAW. I've really only gotten to know Wilma over the past year. For some more personal insight on Wilma, I turn to Tom Koken, who has known Wilma for far longer. This is Tom's quick take. For many of us, Wilma is the go-to expert on labor law. Many of us count on Wilma to make sure we get our interpretations of the law right. Tom went on to describe himself as a frequent non-paying client of Wilma's. He reports that when he asked Wilma if what he wrote in a draft about some point of labor law was correct, her kind and diplomatic response is pretty consistent. Tom, you got it about right. Then she quietly fixes it to make it perfect. Wilma, thank you for all you have done over the years to make workplaces and the lives of workers better and to advance our field and our association, most recently in your role as LERA president. Wilma has chosen to sit for an extended interview for her presidential plenary. She'll be interviewed by Josh Eidelson, and I just want to give a brief intro of Josh. Josh is one of the leading labor journalists in the U.S. today. He covers labor as a contributing writer at The Nation, Salon, and In These Times. He is a contributor at the American Prospect, Alternate, and Dissent, and other respected publications. His reporting on workers' actions at Walmart received a Sidney Award from the Sidney Hillman Foundation. After receiving his MA in political science from Yale, Josh spent 5 years as an organizer for Unite Here in Sacramento, Pittsburgh, and Philadelphia. He appears frequently as a commentator on labor and politics on radio and TV, and he is based in New York. Lastly, Josh was the recipient of LERA's own Kenneth May Media Award in 2020. Wilma and Josh, you have the floor.
Hi, Josh. I am delighted that you agreed to join me in this conversation. You and I have been talking for over a decade. You were a union organizer when at college at Yale, and your career as a journalist covering labor and work has blossomed. You report so insightfully and have learned so much directly from workers, especially young workers, and what's happening in workplaces all over the country. From low wage to high tech. And also you report on the range of dynamic activism going on. You've been following labor policy, especially at the NLRB during different administrations. And you follow what's going on in some state houses around the country. You understand the legal issues like a lawyer. And I always learn from talking with you. I now observe all of this from a distance. No longer as a policymaker, but with the perspective of a long career in labor law and labor relations. First as an advocate, then in government. I see what's going on today with both dread and frustration. Dread about the divides, the hate, the violence, the pain and despair, democratic norms eroding, and democratic institutions under stress. But also with fascination about this historic moment of dynamism in both thought and action, not really seen in a century. I thought that a conversation from our different and across generation vantage points might be of interest to our audience and fun, at least for us. So thank you, Josh.
Thank you so much for having me, Wilma. I've learned a tremendous amount from you over the past decade, and it's a joy to get to have conversations like this, and an honor to be part of this one.
Thank you. So shall we proceed with our conversation?
Please.
You want to start?
Sure. So as you mentioned, your career stretches throughout government and outside of government and a slew of organizations, and you found a way, including since leaving the board, to be involved in some of the most interesting things happening in the workplace. I wonder, to start with, about your experience working on models that are alternatives, like this effort to have a works council with a union at Volkswagen, more recently your work on employee ownership. Have those shifted your perspective from how you saw things when you were at the board? Do you see those as an alternative to NLRA unionism or as something else?
Well, I have been lucky in my post-NLRB life, and it is true that up until then, my focus had been on traditional labor law, both as a union lawyer and during my nearly 14 years as a member, then chair of the NLRB. Since then, my focus has been on some really interesting kind of projects which push the boundaries of traditional labor law, or things that are occurring notwithstanding the law and its limits. You mentioned two things. About maybe 8-9 years ago, I was asked by the United Auto Workers to work with them when they were engaged in an organizing campaign at the Volkswagen plant in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And they were interested and in dialogue with Volkswagen about trying to set up a German-style works council if they were successful in organizing the plant. They consulted me because they wanted to know whether there was a chance that Volkswagen could set up a works council on its own, absent union representation. And my conclusion was that under existing labor law, Volkswagen could not do that. But unfortunately, the organizing campaign did not succeed. There was a lot of outside interference by various politicians in the state. There was a second election, which the union also won also lost more narrowly than the first. But so far, this experiment hasn't occurred. But I would say that the attempt by the United Auto Workers in dialogue with Volkswagen at the time sparked a lot of interest and probably a renewed interest in the German model of co-determination with its enterprise level works councils and worker representation on supervisory boards, along with in the dual model, along with the unions themselves, negotiating with companies and across sectors, the economic pieces of the relationship. There has been a lot of interest in this, but so far it hasn't occurred. More recently, I've also, as you mentioned, been involved in some efforts at worker ownership. I first became knowledgeable about these things when I spent a few years at Rutgers and learned from their experts in worker ownership. More recently, I've been asked to sit on a board of a brand new nonprofit called Ownership Works, which is trying to promote worker equity shares through private equity deals. So I would say about both of these, what's most interesting to me is, and this relates to something else I've done post NLRB, I was asked a few years ago on the occasion of the 100th anniversary of the International Labor Organization to write a paper for a conference that was held in Paris on industrial democracy. Or the labor question that people were talking about a century ago. And the labor question was, the answer to the labor question was widely said to be industrial democracy. But what industrial democracy meant was subject to great interpretation amongst different aspects of labor and social movements, some more radical than others, and amongst employers themselves who talked about industrial democracy but had their own ideas about what it meant. They were hoping, of course, to have some kind of industrial democracy short of independent labor unions or government intervention. But the range included collective bargaining, which the AFL unions promoted. Some, like the Knights of Labor and other groups, promoted worker ownership. Employers, for their part, were instituting employee representation plans, works council type entities. During the First World War, the government did intervene to try to maintain labor peace, and shop committees were set up in industries all over the nation. Unions thought that even though these were non-union, there was some hope that they would turn into union represented organizations. That wasn't to happen. At the end of the First World War, the government retrenched. There was repression by government and by employers of labor. During the 20s, the welfare capitalism model took hold, and employers once again instituted a variety of different kind of worker councils, representation plans, profit sharing, et cetera. But those worker councils, works like the German works councils, were eventually outlawed by the 1935 Wagner Act, which adopted the collective bargaining model as our nation's vision of industrial democracy. And that is what prevails in the law today. So these other things are, and essentially, I think, an attempt, particularly in recent years, to reimagine different earlier forms of industrial democracy. And that's the piece that I find so exciting.
Speaking of this moment that we're in, you referenced, I think, this upsurge that we're seeing around the country in organizing in unexpected places at some of the most prominent, most powerful companies in the United States. It might have seemed safe a few years ago to assume that a labor board vote at a Starbucks cafe or an Amazon warehouse would, at best for the labor movement, seem like a moral victory, a noble failure. But we've now actually seen certified victories at both companies. How big a deal is this long term? And particularly, how significant can the impact of these kinds of wins be in the absence of federal labor law reform? Is there still a catch-22 between an upsurge in worker organizing and a transformation of the labor law? Or has that catch-22 somehow been blown up by some of these victories we've been seeing recently?
So that's a multi-part question. So where do I begin? And let me just say, let me start with a piece of your first question that I didn't answer, whether I see these other things as alternatives to traditional labor unions. I do not see them as alternatives. I see them as complementary. I think we have a very complex economy, and I think there's room for a lot of different forms of worker voice, worker engagement, worker power. And I think that's what's most interesting about this moment. There is a dynamism of both activism and intellectual thought that we really haven't seen perhaps in 100 years. Certainly this worker activism, which we've seen accelerated, is remarkable. It's really an historic moment. I think it began about 10 years ago, first with Occupy Wall Street, then with the Fight for 15, which started small in New York City and now has grown all over the country and in fact globally. But I think certainly this activism has really been accelerated during the pandemic with the intersecting crises, both of the virus, the attendant economic consequences, the racial justice crisis, the climate crisis, the democracy crisis. All of these intersecting and cascading crises, I think, have led to a growing awareness by lots of people, particularly workers, of the inadequacies of our social contract, of the weakness of our social safety net, of the fact that workers have become terribly disempowered. They've lost a voice. And the tremendous discontent and frustration that has bubbled up. We've seen this not only with the so-called Great Resignation, with people leaving jobs and moving to other jobs, but in the demands for higher wages. Some of that, of course, is a result of the Fight for 15, which didn't result in widespread unionization, but did result in minimum wage hikes all over the country. So I think what we are seeing is a very complex kind of thing. The worker organizing that we see is both with traditional unions and with startup organizations like the Amazon win in Staten Island. But even the year before, the loss at the Amazon Bessemer plant, I think, was significant. Obviously, there's nothing like winning. And winning is contagious, as we're seeing at Starbucks. But the attention that got, both by the media, and I have to footnote here, Josh, that I think reporters like you and other labor reporters who are covering these workplace stories are really a major factor in the growing awareness of the public of the needs of workers. 10 years ago, you didn't see the newspapers and the media plastered with stories about what's going on in the workplace. So I think we're seeing all different kinds of worker organizing, some of it, again, with the goal of collective bargaining, some of it not yet. But this is something that people ignore at their peril, especially the corporate world. So, I forgot to answer your question about labor law reform, and is this a catch-22?
Well, compound questions are hopefully more allowable here than in an administrative law judge hearing.
Well, I think this is all happening without labor law reform. And I have always thought that labor law reform would happen only with a reinvigorated worker movement or labor movement. And so, I think it's going to go that direction rather than vice versa. It's a catch-22 in the sense that labor law reform would presumably also catalyze more union organizing. But I don't think, given our deep partisan divides and our deep divides on these kinds of issues, and not to mention the war on government that is so so powerful in our country. I don't think that we will see significant labor law reform absent sustained, powerful worker activism.
I want to turn to the role of your old home, the NLRB, in all of this. Right now, following President Biden's appointments, we have a general counsel who's taken an unusually ambitious approach to trying to change precedent, not only from Trump, but going back to Eisenhower and presidents in between. We have a Democratic majority who signaled they take a broader view of what the act protects. What do you expect we will see by the time the Republicans again are back in power and able to replace these folks? What do you think can or should get done?
Well, that depends on when the Republicans come back in power, if they come back in power. But what we are seeing, obviously, and you've written about this a lot, is a very aggressive, ambitious general counsel. Some of it is a result of the profound and sweeping precedent changes during the Trump administration. Some of it, I think, is occasioned by what we just talked about, the amazing activism and dynamism going on in workplaces. And also a younger generation of workers, with all that represents, both the diversity, changing needs and demands, a desire for a voice. Yeah, they want economic improvements, but they also want a voice. They want dignity in the workplace, as far as I can tell. So I think the dynamics of the younger workers, and I'd be interested in your perspectives on this, because you talk to a lot of them, I know, but I think that is really making for some interesting cases coming before the NLRB. So far, the board itself has not issued any of the precedent-setting cases. They have had a lot thrown at them, not to mention undoing some of the rulemaking that the Trump board engaged in. Rulemaking is very time-consuming and labor-intensive. But what I think is for sure is what we will see coming out of this board is a much more dynamic, living view of the law than we've seen certainly during the Trump administration. When I talk about living law, that's a Louis Brandeis notion of keeping the law alive. Of course, the board has to act within the constraints of this aging statute. Not really amended since 1947. They have to act within the constraints of decades of precedent that they have to navigate, and they have to act mindful of a very skeptical and hostile judiciary, even more so as a result of the Trump appointments. I think any board committed to a dynamic interpretation of the law can make very meaningful change, but somewhat modest. They can't make radical change without statutory change. And the board, of course, is known for flip-flopping or policy oscillation. We'll see that again, absent any kind of real statutory change. But few areas of the law, I'm sure they will make some noticeable rulings, and those would cover the coverage issues, who's an employee, who's an employer, always vexing issues and issues that sometimes flip-flop. And that has included the issue of graduate teaching assistants, for example, not to mention who's an employee, who's an independent contractor. With remedies, the labor law has famously weak remedies. I'm sure they will do their best to, within the constraints of the law, try to impose meaningful remedies. And then perhaps some of the most interesting cases come within the issues of the scope of concerted activity protected by the law. Workers, again, are pushing, I think, the boundaries of what the board has considered to be within the scope of protected concerted activity. I think we'll see some interesting decisions. I think you've been covering one interesting trial that maybe we could talk about. And then last, I think the board certainly will make some rulings or rulemakings with respect to NLRB election procedures and the oversight of permissible campaign interference.
It's interesting. Again, this also goes to this industrial democracy question that you raised at the beginning. I was surprised reading one of Nelson Lichtenstein's books a while ago to learn just how common that was in US mainstream political discourse a century ago in a way it isn't now. And it's been interesting for me traveling around the country talking to Starbucks workers to see what a theme of the campaign, democracy and having a voice in the workplace has been, that many of these workers have been insistent that there is no particular issue or even set of issues that the company could resolve that would sufficiently mitigate their sense that they need a seat at the table. And they point frequently to Starbucks' invocation of an empty chair that's at the table representing them. And now they're in collective bargaining, trying to negotiate an actual seat in that actual chair with the company. I know we're almost out of time. I do wonder, when we talk about the board, now that you have the perspective of these years since leaving, are there particular issues that you wish you had been able to tackle more while you were there, or approach in a different way?
Well, the coverage issues always interested me because I was quite struck during my time at the board how ingenious the business world was in the way they structured their operations, and particularly the way they arranged for work to be done. And that often led to issues of whether they were the employer of the workers in question, whether they had to bargain with them, whether they were joint employers, whether they were considered an alter ego or a single employer in the parlance of the law, whether the workers were independent contractors or their employees. I would have liked to have been able to decide some of those issues. I wrote dissenting opinions on some of those classification issues. The board, after I left, did issue some decisions. Those have been subsequently reversed by the Trump board. In fact, I have said to some of my colleagues that I felt a little bit canceled in some of the decisions, but I spent 8 years in the minority during the Bush years. And I have to say that perhaps what I am most attached to and maybe most proud of is the body of dissenting opinions, because even if the majority opinions get overruled, the dissents are still out there and still can migrate to a majority position at some time in the future. But I wanted to comment, Josh, also about democracy and political democracy, because that was a theme 100 years ago, that and this was a Brandeis notion as well, that you couldn't really have political democracy without democracy in the workplace. And one of the notion of the labor question, which people say has arisen again in this new Gilded Era, the notion of the labor question was that there was a gap between the promise of democracy or the American dream and the grim realities of life for so many people, for so many working people. And so I think these issues are as real today as they were 100 years ago. As we are seeing the erosion of some democratic institutions, I think these issues are even as important as they have ever been. And I think workers do realize that. There are also a couple of bills that have been introduced into Congress that would mandate a worker representation on corporate boards. I think, as I said earlier, this is part of the German model of co-determination that has fascinated some people. I don't think we can just simply export the German model into our society, but I think, and this is what I tried to say at the beginning, I think we need to be open-minded to new approaches. To not in place of traditional unionism or collective bargaining by any means, but to perhaps open up the dialogue, to engage more. One of the things that I think is most sad is the lack of any kind of meaningful dialogue between labor, business, and government. But they have that in Europe. That's the so-called social dialogue, or the social partners. That, I think, is sorely missing from our climate. And I would like to hope that this historic moment will lead to some more opening up of that dialogue. Whether it's going to be a transformational moment in terms of profound change and improvement, I guess remains to be seen. It will require, I think, a lot of public attention, a lot of writing by you about these issues, you and your colleagues, an opening up of the business world, some courageous business leaders who are willing to say we need a new approach. We can't just have this traditional knee-jerk anti-unionism. And I think the business world has to do that, that they, at their peril, will if they ignore the alienation, the frustration, the voicelessness, the powerlessness of workers. We are seeing the results of that in many respects right now.
Thank you. I think we're about to be out of time, and you've summed it up very well. I really appreciate your inviting me to have this conversation, and let's keep it going for the months and years ahead.
Thank you, Josh. I really appreciate your willingness to do this with me. I wish we had a little more time because I know you have lots of things you could share with us, but I know you're going to continue writing and your voice will be out there for a long time to come. So thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Wilma. I've been asked, by the way, to amend my introduction to include the fact that both Wilma and Josh are Philly natives. Not sure why that's relevant, but for the record, that is the case. I also want to thank everybody for attending this presidential event. Before we conclude, I want to say that I'm very hopeful that we'll see all of you in June of 2023 in person for LERA's 75th annual meeting at the Motor City Casino Hotel in Detroit. The dates are June 1st to the 4th, 2023. I'd also like to announce that the dates of LERA's 76th annual meeting will be June 26 to 30, 2024. That meeting will be held in Manhattan. As you may have heard, this meeting will be held in conjunction with both the LERA Triennial World Congress. And if you haven't attended a World Congress, you should put that on your bucket list. In addition, it will be held in conjunction with the FMCS National Labor Management Conference. And all of this will take place at the Midtown Manhattan Hilton. Now, before you get too concerned about taking a loan out to get a hotel room, I got to tell you that our past president, Harry Katz, has worked some magic and conjured something that's very rare nowadays, and that is reasonably priced hotel rooms at an outstanding Manhattan hotel. So it's not only going to be exciting, it's also going to be reasonably affordable. So mark your calendars now for 2024. Before we break, I just want to remind everybody that there are 6 great sessions starting at 3 p.m. There's another session on global supply chains, one on job quality and work scheduling, another on disability inclusion and voice, one on virtual teams, one on critical perspectives on worker voice, and one of our best paper sessions on union support. So again, thanks everyone for attending and enjoy the rest of the program.